Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime, here at my next Avatar Weekly Discussion Topic video. A bit earlier in the week than I usually do these, but this just came to mind, and I didn't have any other video to record today, so I might as well just do it now. The topic for this video, as you can see from the title, is going to be my own ideas for future Avatar comics. Basically stuff I think they can do with other characters in specific comic stories that I think are worth doing. Now, I suppose ultimately this isn't something that is 100% comic focused, in that this is just kind of ideas I think certain characters can have, and it doesn't have to relate to the comics. But of course, the comics are probably going to be the only place we are ever going to get more story. So yeah, let's just jump straight into it. I think the story I've talked about the most, that I've mentioned multiple times that I really want, is I want Iroh's full backstory. I want all the pieces of his backstory that we know pieced together and just told to us in a story so we can really further understand the character. Such an interesting character, so many interesting things we do know about, but what is the thing that pieces everything together? Now, what are those pieces? Well, first of all, just the idea that he used to be different, but still closer to what we usually consider to be a Fire Nation kind of general military person, in that he was quite cruel, he was, conquering places and stuff like that in the name of the Fire Nation. And obviously things very much changed for him with the death of his son, Lu Ten. I think this story could be used to, one, introduce who Iroh's wife is, why we don't know anything about her, establish a little bit of, kind of early days with him and Lu Ten, and stuff like that. A lot of people often bring up the theory about Iroh's wife or whatever, that potentially she died giving birth to Lu Ten, which is why Lu Ten is so important to Iroh, and why, him effectively becoming, Zuko's father figure is such an important thing for him. I definitely buy into that idea. I think that would be a cool thing to add to the story. But of course, actually show us the events leading up to Lu Ten's death, introduce him as a character through flashback, and let us get to know who this character was, rather than just being Iroh's son who died and that's all we know about him, full stop. In what sort of a battle was he killed? Was Iroh in any way near the battle when it happened, or what? That's the sort of stuff I'd like to know. What did he do then? We sort of know that he refused to obviously take up the throne and stuff like that. Through the search, we know the exact details of what Ozai did, but what is Iroh doing during that entire time? We get established to us that he actually had a pretty decent relationship with Ursa, so establish some of their interactions, establish his, I suppose, thoughts on a very young Zuko and Azula and stuff like that. What are his relationships like at an early stage with his nephew and niece? All of this sort of stuff you can do in an Iroh kind of backstory focused comic. And yeah, of course, the immediate aftermath of that, he refuses to take up the position of Fire Lord after the death of Azulon. Where does he go from there? We know at some point he goes into the spirit world, which is why he's able to see spirits. But how did that happen? Okay, he's a spiritual man ultimately, but how does he become spiritual after initially not really coming across that way? How did he join the Order of the White Lotus organization? How long has he been part of that? He seems to be basically the most well-respected member of it at this point in time. So was he in it during his time? Was before or after the attack on Ba Sing Se, or what? Who introduced him to it? Was this what ultimately led him to become spiritual and kind of go into the spirit world? And then there's a few other little moments as well. He mentions he studied waterbenders, obviously suggesting trips to the water tribes, and that's how he developed his lightning redirection technique. So you could establish that happening, him having the idea for the technique and using it potentially for the first time. That's another interesting thing you can do. When did he go to the ancient Sun Warrior temple and meet the dragons and come up with the whole Dragon of the West idea, to the point where that becomes a really big title for him? Actually, thinking about it just now, the fact that he has that title would suggest that he was protecting the dragons from a very much further back than I suppose we assume, like potentially before the death of Lu Ten. So that I've actually found that pretty interesting. Like again, like the timeline is very confusing with Iroh, just like when did these events exactly take place. But I think a lot of fans, including myself actually, may be actually over exaggerating how evil, quote unquote, Iroh was prior to the death of Lu Ten. I think, yes, he was misguided, obviously, in terms of like he saw that dream of him taking over Ba Sing Se, but he misinterpreted it as conquering it, whereas in fact what he needed to do was take it back for the Earth Kingdom, which is ultimately what he does. So I assume he's just there. If they do this story, it's just that he will be misguided and initially come across as a little bit more like his brother compared to the Iroh that we know right now. That's another relationship they could really get into, one that we have hints at it being very bad and fractured relationship, but us really not knowing the full extent, having never seen them interact at all. Ozai and Iroh, we don't see them interact ever. That's something I want to see really badly, actually. See what that relationship is like. Does Ozai have this complex about the fact that he's the second born and he resents Iroh for being the firstborn? But yeah, going back to the ancient Sun Warrior thing, like the learning the true way of firebending and stuff like that, and becoming very powerful. It's hard to piece them together. I think the whole Dragon of the West thing gives you a rough idea of when some of the stuff happens, but the full details are not kind of fully known. I think there are other bits to tell as well. Like we know that Iroh was the one who gave Zuko the ship. Like the reason Zuko has a crew at the start of ATLA is because of Iroh. Those crewmates are there because they respect Iroh, not because they're there for Zuko. So I'd like to see that scene happening, and see some moments of them exploring the other air temples, exploring the world, searching for Aang prior to us meeting Zuko at the start of ATLA, and then going like much further on in his life. I think you could almost frame this story set like basically Iroh's last day in the physical world before he transfers over to the spirit world. It becomes the spirit effectively that we know him as from Korra. I think that would be a cool framing device, that either he is just about to meditate over to the spirit world, but he reflects back on his whole life in the physical world or something like that. I think that would be an interesting thing depending on when it happens, and just establish how spiritual he is, and then just start off the idea, like what was his plan with regards to why did he make the decision to linger on in the spirit world and basically become a spirit over time. Because that's a very interesting decision to make for the character, that he specifically kind of feels that he has more to accomplish, and so he lingers on in the spirit world. And just a lot of things like that. I think Iroh is a fascinating character. I don't think it even needs to be like a full multi-part series like The Promise or anything like that. I almost feel you could tell this story in like the equivalent of one part of one of those books, just cutting between various aspects of his life to make connections and tell us about the really important moments. So Iroh, piecing together his backstory, framing it in a more present day Iroh kind of scenario, I think is a perfect thing to do. Another story idea I have would be that, okay, North and South is coming up next, so we're going to get a Water Tribe centric story, which to me seems like it's going to be focused very much on Katara. Hakoda, we know. Sokka, I assume we'll get some focus, but just based on what we're seeing right now, he seems like he's probably not going to be the absolute focus. And he really hasn't been for any of the series for the most part. And I think part of that is because without his space sword, he doesn't seem as effective in combat. There's been a few moments where he's been useful in the comics and stuff like that, but I find it really weird that, okay, we're a year and a half, like 2 years or whatever, on post-ATLA, post him losing the space sword. He still doesn't carry a sword around with him, yet he is meant to be a sword master. And based on all of the covers for North and South, he's holding that weird clubbed thing that sort of works like a sword, and I suppose if he uses it that way, but it fundamentally is not a sword. I think a story they should do at some point, whether it be a full-on comic series or what, should be Sokka searching for the space sword. I think this is your time to have a full-on series, further developing the Sokka-Suki relationship. Just have like those two talk at the start of the series, like, hey, we actually haven't been around each other all that much in the last while. Like, I've been bodyguarding Zuko, you've been traveling around with Team Avatar, you've just returned home. Why don't we do something together? And they go out and search for Sokka's space sword and stuff like that. And it would be interesting because I think you could have something where the two of them return to Kyoshi Island, which is obviously like part of the Earth Kingdom, which is where effectively the sword was lost over, because obviously he threw it at the people on the airship over the Earth Kingdom. So, you know, Kyoshi Island probably ends up being nowhere near where the space sword actually logically would be, but just in terms of them starting to search the Earth Kingdom for it, it would make sense. I think you could bring Toph along as well, because her meteorite and metal bending could help them find the space sword a lot easier. And just it would allow you to develop the Suki and Sokka's relationship a lot. Having to go out on a mission, encounter some enemies on the way. Maybe they locate where the space sword is, and some bandit is using it and is causing issues with it, and it ends up with Sokka having to fight someone using his sword and then claiming it at the end. And him and Suki take down a bunch of bandits together. He's got the sword back, and it's just this really cool adventure where they've really both proven themselves as warriors and as a couple. I think that would be a nice story to tell, because the last time we really got to see Sokka and Suki talk was a little bit in The Promise, and then the recent free comic book Shells, which was cool but not amazing. So absolutely, I think that's something they should do. I think if this was to be a comic series, I think you could have a side plot of seeing what Ty Lee is like in or around the Kyoshi Warriors, kind of home base of Kyoshi Island. I'm kind of speculating that at the end of Smoke and Shadow, Kalo and Ty Lee may end up as a couple, so you can maybe develop that relationship as well. Just have some of the notable Kyoshi Warriors be a part of this story, and that sort of thing. So they're the really two obvious stories that come to mind, in the sense of that would then leave it as okay, we've had a main comic series focusing on basically every member of Team Avatar. That Sokka-Suki one would cover the last two members in need of a story. North and South, I assume, is going to be Katara focused and give Sokka some focus, and then Sokka-Suki is really the last thing, really. So after that, I really think the comics need a time skip, because the problem they're very quickly running into, and I think it's probably one that a lot of people will catch on to by the end of North and South, is going to be that it doesn't make any sense that Team Avatar will have encountered this many big issues in a row without time passing. That there's just no way that, okay, there was this conflict here, then we moved on, and there was a conflict here. Immediately after that, there was this conflict, followed by this one, and then this one. All the time, just a year after the war has ended. I think you need to time skip ahead a bit and cover some stuff with the characters as young adults, basically. And and I think they should do this because, one, I think a lot of people really want to see these characters when they're older, like Team Avatar in or around the Korra crew's age by the end of the series, where you see their relationships are more mature and stuff like that, and you see the potential leading towards where they ultimately go. Like, I would love to see Katara and Aang get engaged, their wedding and stuff like that, them as parents for the first time. That's the sort of stuff I'd really like to see. Ultimately, it doesn't really fit too effectively into like being a comic series that they're going to release, because the focus of the series is just on like relationship stuff, which is perhaps not what they really want to market Avatar comics as, just like as an aspect of it. And given like the way Korra is set up, they would have referenced super crazy events happening during like the wedding or the birth of their children and stuff like that, and we wouldn't have been like missing out on that. And I suppose, speaking of Korra, I think there's a lot of flashback stuff that you could cover in comics. I think the Korra comics coming up, the recent ones, really need to delve into Kuvira and Suyin a lot more than Book 4 did. Looking back on that more and more, that was a huge misstep, not explaining that relationship a lot more. I think you can very much finish that series and not fully grasp that Suyin adopted an orphan Kuvira. And there's very little hint in the series of any sort of a really strong relationship between the two. You can tell that they know each other quite well, and Sue trusts Kuvira early on, but it doesn't really feel in any way motherly. I didn't understand too much Kuvira's kind of descent to evil, I suppose. I think going into some sort of a flashback thing where you cover Suyin taking a young Kuvira in, training her, I suppose, in mailbending and stuff like that, giving her these positions and stuff like that, helping her along, going a lot more in depth into the whole issue of like Suyin not wanting to take over control of the Earth Kingdom at that point in time, and really focusing on Kuvira and what exactly she does upon seeing this rejection. How does she get Baatar on board? How does that relationship develop? How exactly does her leaving Zaofu like really work and affect everything? That's a little one you can go into. I think in terms of being more of a kind of standalone story, kind of like the Iroh thing, I think the backstories of like all of the Red Lotus members from Book 3 is something that probably should be told at some point, because it comes across really badly with some of these characters, Ghazan and Minghua especially. We don't know anything about them. Pili we know a little bit more about, and Zahir a little bit again. I'd like to know the backstory for all of them, how they came together as a group, what each of them and what their individual reasons are for supporting and joining the Red Lotus. Why do they support chaos? Why do they support the goal of freeing Vaatu and stuff like that? This story would also allow you to tell the exact details of what happened during their first kidnapping attempt of Korra, show Unalaq giving them the mission to kidnap Korra, show the battle against, who is it? Tenzin, Tonraq, Zuko, and Sokka. I think that they're the four people who defended Korra and kept her from being captured. I'd love to see that fight and see what happens there, because obviously when we see the second kidnapping attempt, it's a very old Zuko. Tenzin, for the most part, really isn't involved in the fight all that much until much later on. I'd like to see this kind of 4-on-4 fight between like some of the coolest benders we've ever seen, and then some of the most kind of amazing, kind of famous warriors in history, benders, non-benders included. But yeah, with Ghazan, of course, you can establish like, okay, what's the deal about Ghazan and his tattoos? Where did he originally come from? Why does he believe so strongly in the Red Lotus that he would commit suicide at the thought of being captured and put in prison? What happened to him? Was he put in prison before? Did something happen to him? What are his origins with regards to lava bending? Like, is he like Bolin in that he's an earthbender, but one of his parents is a firebender? are you going to somewhat establish how the lava bending technique comes into being, why certain people have that technique and some don't? You can do a lot of stuff outside of just Gazan's character and personality with that story. But definitely the whole tattoo thing and his culture is an interesting aspect, and how he came to join the crew as well is interesting. Minghua, I think the story almost tells itself. From an early age, obviously growing up with being born with no arms, discovering bending gave her freedom and stuff like that. Obviously something must have happened to her to again cause her to believe really heavily in freedom. But which water tribe does she come from? Does she have a connection to any other person? How did she come to join the Red Lotus, and etc. and stuff like that? And especially like given that they hate the Order of the White Lotus, did they encounter the White Lotus at any point in their life that caused them to hate them? With Pali, you can obviously cover the whole thing that Zahir mentioned, but we didn't get details on of the whole warlord holding Pali hostage and kind of using her as a weapon. But even going further back than that with Pali, establish some sort of a connection, like the whole Gazan thing with his ability. We start to tell us a little bit about why all of the combustion benders that we know look the same. They're all very tall people. They all have a tattoo on their forehead, which is where the technique is kind of from. There's an instant similarity there with being both of the combustion benders we know are very large people in terms of being tall, physically imposing, having a lot of strength, and of course the tattoo on the forehead. So are you going to establish why that technique seems to be specific to those type of people? Like, for example, imagine Aang had combustion bending. He's especially like 12-year-old Aang. He's a relatively small character. He'd be sent flying every time he used the technique. So to use combustion bending effectively, you kind of have to have a strong base. So you have to be quite large and stuff like that. So there's that. How did she come to the knowledge of people? Is there any connection to Combustion Man? That sort of thing, straight away. Zahir, again, really interesting because he's a non-bender as far as we were aware. So he went into the fight to kidnap Korra for the first time as a non-bender. What was his fighting style like back then? How interested in airbender culture was he back then? He seemed to be the leader of the group even back then. What was his interactions with Unalaq? I think he's the one you can probably go into the most depth on because, of course, you established he saved Pali. So it seems like he was the one who had the group kind of form around him. So you establish how he and Pali met, but you don't establish how those two then met the other two, Pali and Gazan. That's a story to tell as well. Absolutely. And there's enough content there, I think, just in terms of like interesting things to have that note. A lot of people obviously speculated during Korra about the whole Suyin circus picture, in that there's a bunch of characters in Korra who have mentioned that like they went left and joined the circus, and like Varric mentions it at one point, Suyin of course mentioned it, and then Zahir mentions it, and there's a character who looks like Zahir in the poster. What are his origins and stuff like that? Why is he interested in poetry and that sort of thing? Like and what's his reason for believing so heavily in freedom as well? That's what I want to know. How did his relationship with Pali really start from being I saved you to becoming romantic as well? So that's another Korra story I think you can tell. And I think Korra probably has another good few stories as well that you can tell. I think a lot of Mako kind of detective stories would be fun to get. See him taking down triads and that sort of thing. But yeah, going back to Avatar actually, I think that there's just a lot of other minor characters that you can tell stories about as well. Like, of course, you have the moment in which episode is it? I think it's obviously they're at the Eastern Air Temple and the group is separated. I can't remember which exact episode it happens in. But Team Avatar, which is quite large at this point after the failed invasion midway through book 3, the team splits up. You have basically Team Avatar brings Suki with them, and then the rest of the characters, like it's the Duke, Chit-Sang is with them and stuff like that. Where does that group go? I think that's a fun little story to tell. And then just in general, I like a kind of course, I think everyone knows the other Dark Horse book, The Lost Adventures, which tells little stories in between the books of Korra, Avatar. I'd like a Lost Adventures 2 focusing on Korra and maybe telling some little stories from in between events in like the Avatar comics as well. I think there's a lot you can do with that sort of a dynamic, just small stories that don't have to be really big. But yeah, I'm going to end it there because I don't have like 100 different story ideas just off the top of my head to talk about. This is definitely a video where in the comments I want to know what your thoughts are on potential comic ideas and stories that they should tell. Of course, give your thoughts on mine, especially the 3 or 4 that I kind of went into a little bit of depth on that I feel there's actually something to. But leave your own suggestions in the comments below as well. So other than that, that's been the video. Thanks for listening, and bye.